The stagecoach driver would not take her past the crossroads, muttering something about cursed ground and dead vines. And so Lucy Whitaker climbed down into the red dust of the Sonoma Valley in the spring of 1878, hauled her trunk from the boot with her own 2 hands, and began the last 3 miles on foot toward a vineyard she had never seen and an inheritance she was not entirely sure she wanted. The letter from the lawyer in San Francisco had been brief and businesslike, the kind of letter that changed a life in 3 paragraphs. Her great-uncle Elias Whitaker had died without children, without a wife, and without any heir closer than Lucy herself, the daughter of his younger brother who had gone east to Boston decades before and never returned. The vineyard, some 40 acres of hillside above a dry creek bed, had been left to her outright, along with the stone farmhouse, the wine cellar cut into the hill, and a debt to the county that made the lawyer's handwriting grow smaller and more apologetic by the final page. Lucy had read that letter a dozen times on the long train journey west, and a dozen times more on the rattling stagecoach from Sacramento, and each time the same stubborn thought rose up in her chest. She had nothing left in Boston. Her mother had died of the fever 2 winters past, her father long before that, and the small dress shop where she had worked her fingers raw for 6 years had finally failed when the owner took ill and closed its doors for good. She was 24 years old, unmarried, with no family left to speak of and no prospects to keep her rooted to a city that had never once been kind to her. A vineyard, even a ruined one, was more than she had owned an hour before that letter arrived. The road climbed steadily through oak-studded hills gone gold and green with the last of the spring rains, and the air smelled of warm earth and wild fennel. Lucy's boots were not made for walking, and by the time the farmhouse came into view around a bend in the road, her feet ached and her traveling dress was gray with dust to the knee. She stopped at the crest of the hill and looked down at what she had inherited, and her heart sank somewhere into her stomach. The vineyard rows marched down the slope in uneven lines, but they were choked with wild grass and blackberry bramble, half the stakes rotted through and leaning like drunken men. The vines themselves, what she could see of them, were gnarled and untended, some clearly dead, their bark gray and split. The farmhouse was worse. Its roof sagged in the middle, one shutter hung by a single hinge, and the porch steps had collapsed entirely, leaving a gap like a missing tooth. A stone barn stood a little apart, its door hanging open to whatever creatures had made a home inside. Weeds grew waist-high in what had once perhaps been a kitchen garden. Lucy set down her trunk and simply stood there for a long moment, the wind pulling strands of dark hair loose from her pins, and she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of despair before she straightened her spine the way her mother had taught her to do when the world seemed determined to knock her down. She had come 3,000 miles. She was not going to be undone by an overgrown hillside. She was still standing there, gathering her courage, when she heard the low, warning growl of a large dog somewhere behind the barn, and then a man's voice, deep and unhurried, calling the animal back. A moment later, a figure came around the corner of the barn, and Lucy's breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with despair. He was tall, taller than any man she had known in Boston, with shoulders that filled out a buckskin coat worn soft and pale with age, and forearms bared where he had rolled his sleeves that showed muscle earned from labor rather than leisure. His hair was dark and a little too long, curling against his collar, and a few days' growth of beard shadowed a strong jaw. He carried an axe loose in one hand, and beside him walked a big gray dog that watched Lucy with more curiosity than menace. The man stopped at the sight of her, clearly as surprised to see a woman standing amid the ruined vines as she was to see him at all. "This is private land," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat caution of a man used to trespassers. "Whitaker land. Been empty a long while now." "I know," Lucy said, lifting her chin. "I am a Whitaker, Lucy Whitaker. Elias was my great-uncle. He left this place to me." Something shifted in the man's face, surprise giving way to a careful reassessment. He set the axe head down against a fence post and came a few steps closer, close enough that Lucy could see his eyes were a deep, warm brown, the color of the oak bark on the hills around them. "John Prescott," he said. "I have a cabin up in the hills behind here, been keeping half an eye on the place since Elias passed, mostly to keep the coyotes and the drifters out of the cellar. Didn't figure anybody would come to claim it. Man from the bank rode through last fall saying the county might take it for the debt if nobody stepped forward." "Well," Lucy said, "somebody has stepped forward." She looked past him at the ruin of a vineyard, and some of her resolve must have shown plainly on her face, because John's expression softened into something like sympathy. "It is worse than it looks," he said, and then, seeing her expression, "No, I suppose it is not. It is about exactly as bad as it looks. But the roots are old. Elias planted these vines near 30 years back, brought the cuttings from a mission garden down south. Old roots do not die easy, even when a man stops tending them. Give the vines a hard pruning, clear the bramble, get water to them again, and you might be surprised." Lucy studied him, this stranger who spoke of her family's land with more knowledge than she herself possessed. "You knew my uncle?" "Well enough. He was a stubborn old cuss, forgive my saying so, but he knew grapes better than any man in this valley. Taught me some of it myself back when I first came out here." John's gaze moved briefly to her trunk, sitting forlorn in the dust, and then to the darkening sky beyond the western ridge. "You are not planning to sleep in that house tonight?" It was not quite a question. Lucy looked at the sagging roof and the broken porch and felt a fresh wave of exhaustion. "I had not entirely worked out my plans beyond arriving," she admitted. "There is a room off the back that is sound enough. Elias kept it dry even when the rest went to ruin. I can get a fire started for you and see the worst of the debris cleared from the doorway before dark. Won't be comfortable, but it will not have snakes in it either, which is more than I can say for the front rooms." Lucy should have been wary of a strange man's offer of help, alone as she was on an isolated hillside with the sun sinking fast, but there was something steady in John Prescott's manner, something that put her more at ease than any smooth-talking gentleman back in Boston ever had. Perhaps it was the plain honesty in the way he spoke, or the gentleness with which he had called his dog to heel rather than let it frighten her. Perhaps it was simply that she was too tired and too far from anywhere else to refuse. "I would be grateful," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "John," he said, "Mr. Prescott makes me feel like my father, and he has been dead 11 years. A faint smile touched his mouth, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his face from merely handsome into something that made her pulse quicken in a way she was not prepared for. "Come on, then. Let us see what can be done before the light goes." The back room proved sound as promised, a small chamber with a stone hearth and a narrow bed frame, though the mattress had long since rotted away. John cleared the worst of the dust and cobwebs with brisk efficiency, while Lucy swept the hearth and gathered kindling from a woodpile stacked neatly against the barn wall, evidence that he had indeed been tending the place in small ways for longer than he perhaps wished to admit. By the time the fire caught and threw its orange light against the stone walls, Lucy had produced a bedroll from her trunk, a practical purchase from a mercantile in Sacramento, and John had promised to bring a proper mattress and blankets down from his own cabin come morning. "You will need more than that to make this place livable," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking suddenly uncertain in a way that his earlier confidence had not suggested. "I do not mean to overstep, but a woman alone out here, with the house half fallen down and the vineyard gone wild, that is not a small thing to manage." "I did not come 3,000 miles to be told I cannot manage," Lucy said, though there was no real heat in it. John's mouth curved again, that same slow, warming smile. "No, I do not suppose you did. All right, Miss Whitaker. I will not tell you what you cannot do, but I will offer what help a neighbor might offer if you will have it, and you may tell me to go to blazes whenever you please." "I will keep that in reserve," Lucy said, and for the first time since she had climbed down from the stagecoach, she found herself almost smiling too. He left her then with the fire burning and a promise to return at first light, and Lucy lay awake a long while on her bedroll listening to the strange sounds of the California hills, the call of some night bird she could not name, the distant yip of coyotes, the wind moving through the ruined vines outside her window. She thought of her mother, who had never once spoken of this uncle or this vineyard, and wondered what old family quarrel had severed the connection so thoroughly. She thought of the debt the lawyer's letter had mentioned, and the county that might yet take the land from her if she could not somehow make it pay. And she thought, though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, of John Prescott's steady brown eyes and the easy strength in his shoulders, and she fell asleep at last with that thought lingering, unbidden and unexplained. Morning came bright and clear, and Lucy woke to the sound of hammering somewhere near the front of the house. She dressed quickly in her plainest gown, one more suited to labor than the traveling dress she had ruined the day before, and came around to find John Prescott already at work, rebuilding the collapsed porch steps, his coat shed and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat beading at his temple despite the early hour. The gray dog lay in a patch of sun nearby, thumping its tail when it saw her. "You did not need to do that," Lucy said, though she was grateful. "A woman ought to be able to walk into her own house without breaking her neck," John said, not looking up from his work. "Besides, I brought that mattress I promised and a few other things you will find useful. There is coffee in the pot over the fire if you want it. Made it strong, the way vineyard work demands." Over the following days, a routine established itself between them with a naturalness that surprised them both. John would arrive not long after dawn, sometimes with his dog, sometimes with tools or supplies from his own cabin, and the two of them would work through the long hours of daylight clearing the vineyard row by row. It was punishing labor. Lucy's soft hands, accustomed to needle and thread rather than axe and hoe, blistered and bled within the first week, and she wrapped them in strips of linen and kept working rather than admit the pain to John, though he noticed anyway, as he seemed to notice most things about her. "You are going to ruin your hands entirely if you keep on this way," he said one afternoon, catching her wrist gently as she reached for the hoe again. His grip was warm and careful, his calluses rough against her raw palm, and something in the contact sent a shiver up her arm that had nothing to do with pain. "Let me see." She let him unwrap the linen, and he examined the blisters with a frown, his thumb tracing gently along the edge of a broken one, and Lucy found she could not quite catch her breath while he did it. "You should have said something," he said quietly. "I did not want you thinking me weak," Lucy admitted. John looked up at her then, and there was nothing but plain sincerity in his expression. "Miss Whitaker, you walked 3 miles alone in the dust rather than admit defeat, and you have pulled bramble roots out of this ground with your bare hands for a week straight without a word of complaint. Nobody who has watched you work these past days would ever call you weak." He wrapped her hand again, more gently this time, and found a pair of leather gloves in his saddlebag that had belonged, he said, to his late mother, small enough to fit Lucy's hands. "Wear these from now on. I mean it." She wore them, and though her pride smarted a little at needing his charity, the gesture warmed something in her chest that she did not examine too closely. As the weeks passed, the vineyard began slowly to emerge from its neglect. Row by row they cleared the bramble and cut back the wild grass, and John taught her the proper way to prune the old vines, showing her which canes to cut and which to leave, explaining the whole time with a patience that surprised her in a man who lived alone in the hills, and by his own admission, spoke to few people beyond the occasional trader or trapper. "How did you come to know so much about grapevines?" Lucy asked him one afternoon, as they worked side by side along a row near the creek. "I thought mountain men trapped beaver and hunted elk, not tended vineyards." John laughed, a low, warm sound that Lucy had come to listen for. "I was not born a mountain man, Miss Whitaker. I came out from Missouri near 10 years back, after the war, looking for something the East could not give me any more. Spent some seasons trapping up in the Sierra, made a little money at it, enough to buy the parcel where my cabin sits now." But your uncle, he found me half-starved and half-frozen one winter when I came down out of the high country looking for work, and he took me in, fed me, gave me a place in his barn to sleep, and in exchange I helped him with the vines. Learned more from that old man in 2 winters than I ever learned trapping. He used to say a vine was like a person needed hardship to bring out its best, but too much hardship and it just died on the stake. I think about that a fair amount. He sounds like he was a wise man, Lucy said, feeling a small ache for the great uncle she had never known. Wise and stubborn and lonely, I think, though he never would have said so. John glanced sideways at her. He talked about you once, you know, not often. But he mentioned a niece back east, said his brother had taken the family quarrel with him when he left and never looked back. I do not think he ever expected you would come. I almost did not, Lucy admitted. I had nothing left there. My mother passed 2 winters ago and I lost my position not long after. When the lawyer's letter came, it felt less like an inheritance and more like the only door still open to me. John was quiet a moment, his hands stilling on the vine he had been pruning. I am sorry for your losses, he said finally, but for what it is worth, I am glad the door led you here. Lucy felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with the vines rather than meet his eyes, though the warmth of his words stayed with her long after the sun had set that evening. It was not all easy labor and gentle conversation, however. The valley had its dangers, and Lucy learned quickly that the frontier did not care for a woman's inexperience. In her 3rd week, while walking the fence line alone near dusk, she startled a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a fence post, and only John's sudden shout and quick action with a hoe handle kept her from being struck. He had come running the moment he heard her cry out, moving with a speed that belied his size, and after he had dispatched the snake he had gathered her trembling hands in his own and held them until she stopped shaking, his voice low and steady in her ear. "You are all right," he murmured. "You are all right, Lucy. I have got you." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it, rough with worry and warm with relief, made her realize how much she had come to depend on his presence, how much safer she felt with him near. She did not pull her hands away, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the fading light, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his chest, close enough to see the fear that had been in his eyes only moments before. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me," John said, his voice rough. "Just be more careful. I do not know what I would do if something happened to you out here." The admission hung in the air between them, larger than either of them seemed prepared to acknowledge, and after a moment John cleared his throat and stepped back, releasing her hands, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than was strictly proper. Not all the dangers of the valley came from rattlesnakes, however. Lucy learned soon enough that the vineyard's troubles ran deeper than neglect. On a morning in early summer, a well-dressed man rode up the vineyard road in a fine buggy, his suit too clean for the dust of the country, and introduced himself as Silas Cole, owner of the largest vineyard and the only working winery in the valley, a man whose land bordered the Whitaker property along the eastern ridge, and who, it soon became clear, had hoped Elias Whitaker's death might finally deliver the water rights of the creek into his own hands. "Miss Whitaker, is it?" Cole said, not bothering to descend from his buggy, looking down at her with an appraising coolness that made her skin prickle. "I had heard a relation had come to claim the old place. I confess I am surprised. Most young ladies would have more sense than to take on a ruin like this." "I manage well enough, Mr. Cole," Lucy replied, keeping her voice level though his manner grated on her. "For now, perhaps. But I understand there is a debt owed to the county, a debt your uncle left unpaid for some years. I have made inquiries, and I would be prepared to offer a generous sum for this land, generous enough to clear that debt and leave you a comfortable amount besides. You could return east and live a far easier life than you will find scraping a living from these old vines." "The vineyard is not for sale," Lucy said, though the mention of the debt sent a cold thread of worry through her stomach. Cole's smile did not waver, but something harder entered his eyes. A pity. The creek that feeds this land also feeds mine, Miss Whitaker, and I have water rights filed that predate your uncle's claim by some years. I would hate for there to be any difficulty over its use come the dry season. Good day to you. He turned his buggy and drove off without waiting for a reply, and Lucy stood in the dust watching him go, her hands clenched at her sides. When John arrived a short while later and heard the exchange, his jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before. Cole has been trying to swallow up every small parcel in this valley for years, he said. He undercuts water to the smaller vineyards during dry spells, forces them to sell cheap, then buys up their land for a fraction of its worth. Your uncle held him off for a long while, mostly through spite, I think, and because Elias' claim to the creek was older than Cole liked to admit. But if Cole means to make trouble over water rights now that Elias is gone, we will need to be ready for it. How do we get ready for a man like that? Lucy asked, feeling suddenly very small against the scope of the valley's politics. John's expression softened as he looked at her, and he reached out briefly to touch her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. We keep the vines healthy, we keep the water flowing fair, and we make sure the county clerk in town has a clear record of your uncle's original water claim, filed proper and legal, so Cole cannot simply take what he wants by intimidation. I know the clerk. We will ride into town together and see it done. He paused, and something more personal crept into his voice. You are not facing this alone, Lucy. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that. The warmth in his voice settled something anxious in her chest, and she found herself, not for the first time, grateful beyond words that fate had put John Prescott in her path. The ride into the town of Sonoma took the better part of a day, and Lucy found herself enjoying it despite the seriousness of their errand. The town itself was a modest collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts clustered around a central plaza, with the old Spanish mission standing at one end, and a scattering of newer American businesses springing up along the main street, evidence of the changes the valley had seen since California's admission to the Union some decades before. John seemed known and well-liked by the shopkeepers and townsfolk they passed, and more than one curious glance was cast toward Lucy, the news of Lucy Whitaker's mysterious niece having apparently already spread through the valley's gossip. At the county clerk's office, a thin, spectacled man named Mr. Abernathy confirmed that Lucy Whitaker's water claim on the creek had indeed been filed and recorded some 20 years prior, predating Silas Cole's own claim by a full decade, a fact that Cole had apparently hoped Lucy would not think to verify. Mr. Cole has tried this maneuver before, with the Hendricks place 2 years back, and the Delgado Vineyard before that, Abernathy said, shaking his head as he pulled the dusty ledger from a shelf. Bullied them into selling by threatening their water in a dry summer, though his own claim was junior to theirs the whole while. Most folk do not think to check the record, and by the time they might, they have already sold out of fear and left the valley. You would do well to have a copy of this claim made and kept somewhere safe, Miss Whitaker, and perhaps a word sent to the sheriff as well, should Mr. Cole attempt to interfere with your water directly. Lucy left the clerk's office with a certified copy of the water claim folded carefully into her reticule, feeling for the first time since her arrival that she might actually have a fighting chance at holding onto what her uncle had left her. As they walked back toward where John had left the wagon, she found herself glancing up at him, at the set of his jaw and the protective way he had stood beside her through the whole exchange with the clerk, and something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest. "Thank you for this," she said. "I do not know that I would have thought to check the record myself." "You would have managed," John said, though he looked pleased at her gratitude. "You are more capable than you give yourself credit for, Lucy Whitaker." They stopped at a small mercantile before starting the ride back, and John insisted on purchasing supplies Lucy would need for the vineyards next season: sulfur for the mildew that sometimes plagued the vines in wet years, new stakes to replace the rotted ones, seed for the kitchen garden she hoped to restore. When Lucy protested the expense, John simply waved her off. "Consider it an investment," he said, with a slight smile. "I have grown rather fond of that old place. Would hate to see it fail now, after all the work we have put into it." There was something in the way he said it, something that suggested his fondness extended beyond the vineyard itself, and Lucy felt her cheeks warm as she busied herself examining a bolt of calico fabric rather than meet his eyes. They dined that evening at a small inn on the edge of town before beginning the long ride home in the cool of the evening, and over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, John told her more of his own history, of the family he had left behind in Missouri, a father who had died in the war and a mother who had passed of illness not long after, leaving him with no reason to stay and every reason to seek his fortune in the West. "I thought trapping would be my life," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "But a man gets lonely up in those mountains, season after season, with nothing but the dog for company. When your uncle took me in that first winter, gave me work and a purpose beyond simple survival, it changed something in me. I still keep my cabin up in the hills, still trap a little in the winter months to supplement what the land does not provide. But this valley has become more home to me than anywhere else I have lived since leaving Missouri." "You never married," Lucy said, and immediately wondered if the question was too forward, though her curiosity had gotten the better of her discretion. John's gaze met hers across the small table, steady and warm. "I never found reason to until recently," he said quietly, and the weight of his meaning was not lost on her, though neither of them spoke further of it that night, the moment passing in comfortable silence as they finished their meal and prepared for the ride home beneath a sky thick with stars. The summer deepened, and with it the work of the vineyard intensified. Lucy learned to recognize the signs of a healthy vine and a struggling one, learned the rhythm of irrigation, and the careful balance of water that Cole's threats made all the more precious. John taught her to test the ripeness of the small green grapes as they formed, to watch for signs of pests, to thin the clusters so the remaining fruit would grow richer and more concentrated in flavor. Slowly, the vineyard that had greeted her as a ruin began to show the promise of what it once had been. Rows of vines standing straight and tended, their leaves a healthy deep green against the golden hills. The work brought Lucy and John into closer proximity than either had perhaps anticipated, and the careful distance they had maintained in those early weeks began, inevitably, to erode. There were moments, small and unremarkable in themselves, that accumulated into something larger. The brush of his hand against hers as they worked the same row. The warmth of his laugh when she made some clumsy mistake with the pruning shears, and cursed in a manner unbecoming a lady, a habit she had picked up despite her mother's best efforts at raising her proper. The way he would sometimes catch her watching him as he worked, his shirt damp with sweat and clinging to the muscles of his back, and neither of them would look away quite as quickly as propriety demanded. One evening in late July, after a long day spent repairing the irrigation channel that carried water from the creek down through the vineyard rows, John lingered longer than usual after the work was done, and Lucy found herself in no hurry to send him on his way. They sat together on the newly repaired porch steps, watching the sun sink behind the western ridge and paint the sky in shades of orange and violet. The gray dog sprawled contentedly at their feet. "I have been thinking," John said, breaking a silence that had grown comfortable rather than awkward, "about what will happen come harvest. You will need help beyond what I can provide alone, hands enough to pick the grapes quickly once they ripen, and someone who knows how to press and ferment the wine properly. I know a family, the Delgados, whose vineyard Cole nearly ruined a few years back before your uncle intervened on their behalf with a loan that kept them afloat. They owe your family a debt of gratitude, and I think they would be glad to help, come harvest time, in whatever way they can." "That would be a tremendous help," Lucy said, grateful for yet another way in which John seemed determined to smooth her path. I confess I have been worrying over how I would manage the actual winemaking. I know grapes now, thanks to you, but the process of turning them into something drinkable remains rather a mystery to me." "Your uncle kept detailed notes," John said. "I found them in the cellar some months back, thought to bring them to you when the time was right. His hand is difficult to read, but the information is all there. The proportions and timing he favored, notes on which years produced his best wine and why. I think between his notes and the Delgado's experience and my own poor memory of what he taught me, we can manage a decent vintage this first year." Lucy looked at him in the fading light, at the earnest concern in his expression, the evident care he had taken in planning for her future even in ways she had not thought to ask of him, and something in her chest simply overflowed. "John," she said softly, "why are you doing all this? You owe me nothing. You barely knew me before I arrived, and yet you have given so much of your time and your resources to help me save this place. I do not understand it." John was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon rather than on her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, as though the words cost him something to say. "I told myself at first it was because I owed your uncle a debt I could never fully repay, and helping his niece seemed a fitting way to honor his memory. That was true in the beginning." He turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his brown eyes made her breath catch. "But it stopped being about Elias a good while back, Lucy. I do not rightly know when it happened. Maybe it was watching you pull bramble roots with your bare hands rather than admit you were struggling. Maybe it was the way you looked at this ruined old place that first day, like you saw not what it was but what it could become. I have lived alone in these hills a long time, told myself I preferred the solitude, and then you came walking up that road covered in dust with your chin held high like you were daring the whole valley to tell you that you could not manage, and I have not had a peaceful moment since." Lucy's heart hammered against her ribs. "John," she whispered, uncertain what to say, though her body seemed to know before her mind caught up, leaning slightly toward him on the porch step. "I am not a smooth-talking man," John continued, his voice low and earnest. "I do not have fine words or fine manners, and I have spent more of my adult life talking to a dog than to a woman. But I know my own mind, and my own mind has been full of you since the day you arrived, Lucy Whitaker, and I do not know how much longer I can sit beside you on this porch each evening and pretend that what I feel is nothing more than neighborly concern." "I do not want you to pretend," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper, and it was answer enough. John reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and cupped her cheek in his broad, calloused palm, his thumb tracing gently along her cheekbone. Lucy leaned into the touch, and when he finally closed the distance between them and kissed her, soft and searching at first before deepening as she responded in kind, she felt something settle into place in her chest that had been unmoored since her mother's death, a sense of belonging she had not realized she had been searching for. They broke apart after a long moment, both a little breathless, and John rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cupping her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache with feeling. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted, a rough laugh escaping him. "I am glad you finally did," Lucy said, smiling against his lips as he kissed her again briefly, before pulling back to look at her with an expression of such open affection that she felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "I do not want to rush you," John said. "You have had a great deal of change thrust upon you these past months, a new home, a new life entirely. I do not want you to feel pressed into anything before you are ready." "John Prescott," Lucy said, reaching up to touch his jaw, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "I have been more certain of very few things in my life than I am of this. I did not come west looking for a husband, but I think perhaps fate had other plans for me than the ones I made for myself." They sat together on the porch until the stars came out fully overhead, talking and kissing in equal measure, and when John finally rose to make the ride back to his own cabin, he pressed one last lingering kiss to her forehead and promised to return at first light, as he always did, though now the promise carried a different weight entirely. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of happiness that Lucy had not thought possible for herself, not since the losses that had marked the years before her arrival in California. The work of the vineyard continued, and continued to demand long hours of labor, but now the labor was shot through with moments of tenderness, a kiss stolen in the shade of the barn, a hand held as they walked the fence line together in the evening light, a shared laugh over some small mishap that would have felt like disaster only months before, but now felt like simply another chapter in the story they were building together. John began staying later into the evenings, sometimes sharing supper with her in the small kitchen that Lucy had slowly restored to functionality, the two of them talking long after the meal was finished about everything and nothing, about the future of the vineyard and the past that had brought them each separately to this valley, about small dreams and larger hopes that neither had spoken aloud to another living soul before now. He was, Lucy discovered, a man of deep feeling beneath his quiet exterior, given to noticing small kindnesses and remembering details she had mentioned only once in passing, arriving one morning with a bundle of wildflowers he knew to be her favorite, another day with a book of poetry he had traded for in town, having remembered her offhand comment weeks before about missing the small library she had frequented in Boston. Not all was idyllic, however, and the specter of Silas Cole's ambitions continued to hang over the valley as the summer wore toward its driest months. In August, word came through the Delgado family, who had indeed agreed to help with the coming harvest, that Cole had begun diverting more water than his rights allowed from the upper creek, a maneuver clearly intended to starve the smaller vineyards downstream, including Lucy's own, in advance of the crucial ripening period when the vines needed water most. "He is testing us," John said grimly, standing at the edge of the creek with Lucy one hot afternoon, looking at water levels noticeably lower than they had been even a week before. "Seeing if we will complain, seeing if we have the will to fight him on it. If we let this pass without challenge, he will take more next time and more after that until there is nothing left for the rest of us. Then we will not let it pass," Lucy said, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach at the thought of confronting a man as powerful as Cole. "What do? We ride to the sheriff, present the certified copy of your uncle's water claim, and demand he intervene. It will not make Cole happy, but the law is on our side here, clear as day, and even a man with Cole's money cannot simply ignore a sheriff's order without consequence." The confrontation, when it came, proved less dramatic than Lucy had feared, but no less tense for it. The sheriff, a weathered older man named Sheriff Tanner who had clearly dealt with Cole's ambitions before, rode out personally to the diversion point on the upper creek, and upon examining both the county records and the physical evidence of the illegal diversion, ordered Cole's workers to restore the water flow to its proper allocation, under threat of a substantial fine and potential criminal charges should the violation continue. Cole himself arrived partway through the confrontation, his fine buggy churning up dust as he approached, and his fury upon seeing the sheriff siding against him was evident in the tight line of his mouth and the cold fire in his eyes, though he was careful to keep his voice level in front of the lawman. "This is a misunderstanding, Sheriff, nothing more," Cole said smoothly. "My foreman must have miscalculated the allocation. I assure you it will not happen again." "See that it does not," Sheriff Tanner replied, unimpressed. "Miss Whitaker's claim is clear and predates yours, Mr. Cole, and I will not have you starving out honest folk trying to make a living from this valley's soil. Next time I hear of trouble on this creek, I will not be so gentle about it." Cole's gaze slid to Lucy and John, standing together at the edge of the gathering, and something calculating entered his expression even as his mouth remained set in its false pleasantness. "Miss Whitaker seems to have found herself quite the champion," he said, his eyes flicking meaningfully to where John's hand rested protectively at the small of her back. I wonder if the county clerk knows that your foreman, Mr. Prescott, has been spending rather a great deal of time on your property these past months. One might almost mistake your arrangement for something less than proper, Miss Whitaker, a woman alone taking up so closely with a man who is no relation to her. The insinuation hung in the air, uglier for its calculated delivery, and Lucy felt her face heat with anger rather than shame. Mr. Prescott has done nothing but help me restore my family's land, Mr. Cole, and I will thank you not to suggest impropriety where none exists. Perhaps you might spend less time concerning yourself with my affairs and more time ensuring your own workers respect the water rights of your neighbors. A few of the gathered witnesses, mostly workers and a couple of neighboring farmers who had come to see the dispute resolved, chuckled quietly at Lucy's sharp retort, and Cole's expression darkened further before he mastered it into something more neutral. "I meant no offense," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Simply an observation. Good day to you both." He climbed back into his buggy and drove off, and Sheriff Tanner shook his head as he watched him go. "Do not let Cole's words trouble you overmuch, Miss Whitaker," the sheriff said kindly. "He is a bitter man who cannot stand to be thwarted, and he will say whatever he thinks will wound most when he cannot get his way through more direct means. Mr. Prescott's character is well known and well respected in this valley. Nobody with sense would believe such insinuations." Still, the encounter left Lucy shaken in a way the water dispute itself had not, and that evening, after the sheriff had departed and the water flow had been restored to its proper level, she found herself unusually quiet as she and John rode back toward the vineyard together. "You are thinking about what Cole said," John observed, glancing sideways at her from atop his horse. "I am thinking that I do not want my reputation, or yours, tarnished by a man's spite," Lucy admitted. "And I am thinking that perhaps he was not entirely wrong to observe that our arrangement might appear improper to those who do not know us as well as Sheriff Tanner does." John reined his horse to a stop, and Lucy did likewise, turning to face him in the golden light of late afternoon. "Lucy," he said seriously, "I have never wanted anything to compromise your good name, and if my presence here has caused talk in the valley that troubles you, I will keep my distance, difficult as that would be for me now." "That is not what I meant," Lucy said quickly, reaching across the space between their horses to take his hand. "I do not want you to keep your distance, John. I want the opposite entirely. I only meant that perhaps Cole's spite has given me cause to think about what I truly want for our future, rather than simply allowing circumstance to dictate the shape of things." John's grip tightened on her hand, hope kindling visibly in his expression. "And what is it you want, Lucy Whitaker?" Lucy took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the culmination of months of growing feeling finally finding its voice. "I want you," she said simply. "Not as a hired hand, not as a neighbor who happens by to help with the vines, but as a husband if you will have me. I love you, John Prescott, and I do not care what Silas Cole or anyone else in this valley might say about the propriety of it." For a moment John simply stared at her, and then a smile broke across his face, wide and unguarded in a way Lucy had rarely seen from him, transforming his usually solemn features into something boyish with joy. He dismounted quickly and came to her horse's side, reaching up to help her down, and once her feet touched the ground he pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly, right there on the dusty road with the horses stamping and shifting around them. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "I have loved you, I think, since that first evening, watching you sweep the dust from that hearth like you meant to conquer the whole valley one room at a time. Yes, Lucy. Yes, I will marry you, and gladly, and I do not care one bit what Cole or the whole town has to say about it either." They rode the rest of the way back to the vineyard hand in hand, laughing over nothing in particular, giddy with the newness of their engagement. And that evening they sat together on the porch steps and spoke of practical matters mixed in with their happiness, of when the wedding might be held, of how John's cabin in the hills might be sold or perhaps kept as a hunting retreat, while he moved into the farmhouse permanently as her husband, of how the harvest, now only weeks away, would need to be gathered before any wedding could properly take place, the demands of the land taking precedence even over matters of the heart. The harvest, when it came in mid-September, proved a trial of a different sort than any Lucy had yet faced in her months at the Vineyard. The Delgado family arrived as promised, a large and boisterous clan led by the patriarch, Rafael Delgado, along with his wife and 4 grown children, all of whom set to work with a practiced efficiency that spoke of years of experience in vineyards of their own. The work was exhausting, days that began before dawn and stretched long past dusk, gathering the ripe clusters of grapes into baskets, hauling them down to the stone cellar where the old wine press, cleaned and repaired by John over the preceding weeks, waited to crush the fruit into juice that would, with time and careful attention, become wine. Lucy worked alongside the others, her hands stained purple with grape juice by the end of each day, her back aching in ways she had not thought possible, but the exhaustion was tempered by a fierce joy at watching the fruits, quite literally, of months of labor finally coming to fruition. Lucy Whitaker's notes, difficult to decipher as they were, proved invaluable in guiding the winemaking process, and Rafael Delgado's decades of experience filled in the gaps where the old man's handwriting failed to clarify. Together, Lucy, John, and the Delgado family produced that first autumn a modest but respectable batch of wine, filling barrel after barrel in the cool stone cellar to age through the winter months, and standing amid the fermenting vats with the rich, earthy smell of crushed grapes filling the air. Lucy felt for the first time truly and completely that this valley, this vineyard, this life, had become entirely her own. The wedding took place in October, once the harvest work was fully complete, a modest ceremony held in the small church in town with the Delgado family, and a scattering of neighbors and townsfolk in attendance, including Sheriff Tanner, who had taken a particular liking to the couple after the water dispute, and insisted on standing as a witness. Lucy wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Delgado had helped her sew from fabric purchased on their trip to town, a far cry from the elaborate weddings she had once imagined as a girl in Boston, but far more meaningful for its simplicity and the genuine warmth of those gathered to celebrate with them. John stood at the front of the small church looking uncharacteristically nervous in a dark suit that fit him well but seemed to constrain his usual ease of movement. And when Lucy walked down the short aisle toward him, her hand tucked through the arm of Rafael Delgado, who had offered to stand in for the father she no longer had, John's expression softened into something so full of love and wonder that Lucy nearly wept before the ceremony had even properly begun. "You look beautiful," John murmured as she reached his side, and the minister, an elderly circuit rider who visited the valley only once a month, cleared his throat with a knowing smile before beginning the ceremony proper. They exchanged vows that were simple and heartfelt, promises to stand together through hardship and plenty, through drought and flood, through all the trials that a life on the frontier might bring. And when John slid a plain gold band onto her finger, a ring he had commissioned from a silversmith in town using some of the profits from that first modest harvest, Lucy felt the full weight and joy of the commitment settle over her like a warm embrace. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, and John did not wait for further permission before pulling Lucy into his arms and kissing her thoroughly, to the delighted applause and laughter of those gathered to witness it. They celebrated afterward at the vineyard itself, tables set up beneath the oak trees near the farmhouse, laden with food the Delgado women had prepared, and wine from the previous year's small private stock that Elias himself had laid down before his death, a fitting tribute to the man whose legacy had brought them together, even if he had not lived to see the union himself. As the celebration wound down into evening, John found Lucy standing alone near the edge of the vineyard rows, looking out over the neat lines of vines stretching down toward the creek, silvery in the moonlight, and he came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her close against his side. "Any regrets, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked softly, and the sound of her new name on his lips sent a thrill through her that she suspected would never entirely fade. "Only that it took me 24 years to find my way here," Lucy said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But I suppose everything happens in its proper season, does it not? Even the vines know that much." "They do indeed," John agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And this vineyard has taught me more patience than I ever thought myself capable of. But I think, looking at what we have built here together this past year, that the waiting was worth it." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the moon rise over the hills that had become, for both of them, the truest home either had known, and Lucy felt a deep and abiding certainty that whatever trials still lay ahead, she would face them with John Prescott at her side, and that together, there was very little the frontier could throw at them that they would not be able to overcome. The years that followed brought their own share of challenges, as any life on the frontier inevitably did, but they brought far more joy than hardship, and the vineyard that Lucy had once feared was beyond saving grew, year by year, into something that would have made Elias Whitaker proud beyond measure. Silas Cole did not entirely abandon his ambitions toward the valley's smaller vineyards, and there were further disputes over water rights and land boundaries in the years that followed. But with Sheriff Tanner's continued vigilance, and the united front presented by the valley's smaller landholders, banded together now in a cooperative arrangement that Lucy herself helped organize, Cole's power to bully his neighbors gradually diminished, until eventually he sold his own vineyard to a more reasonable buyer and left the valley altogether, seeking easier prey elsewhere in the state. The vineyard itself flourished under Lucy and John's combined stewardship, its wines earning a modest but growing reputation throughout the region, sold not only locally but eventually shipped as far as San Francisco, where a discerning clientele came to appreciate the particular character of the Whitaker Prescott vintage, as it came to be known. A blend that honored old Elias' original plantings, while incorporating some of the newer techniques that John and Lucy learned through the years from the broader winemaking community that grew up throughout the Sonoma Valley as more settlers arrived, and more vineyards took root in the fertile hills. 2 years into their marriage, Lucy gave birth to their first child, a son they named Elias in honor of the great uncle whose legacy had brought them together, a robust and healthy boy who grew up practically among the vine rows, learning to walk with his small hands gripping the wooden stakes his father had driven into the earth. John proved as devoted a father as he had been a partner in restoring the vineyard, patient and gentle even as his son grew into a rambunctious toddler determined to investigate every corner of the property, and Lucy often found herself pausing in her work simply to watch the two of them together, John's large, strong hands guiding his son's smaller ones as he taught the boy, far too young to truly understand, the proper way to check a vine for ripening fruit. A daughter followed some 2 years after that, named Margaret after Lucy's own mother, a spirited girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. And then, several years later, another son they named William, rounding out a family that filled the once-empty farmhouse with laughter and noise in a way that would have seemed impossible to Lucy on that first dusty afternoon, when she had stood alone surveying the ruin of her inheritance. The farmhouse itself underwent its own transformation through the years, expanded and improved as the family's needs grew and the vineyard's profits allowed for such investments. The sagging roof was replaced entirely. The porch that John had first repaired for her expanded into a wide veranda where the family took their meals in the warm months, looking out over the vineyard rows that stretched down toward the creek, now reliably flowing thanks to the water rights that Lucy had fought so hard to protect in those early days. John never did sell his old cabin in the hills, though he moved permanently into the farmhouse upon their marriage. And in later years, as their children grew old enough to appreciate such adventures, he took to bringing them up to the old cabin on camping trips through the summer months, teaching Elias and later William the skills of tracking and hunting that he himself had learned during his years as a trapper, while Margaret, who took after her mother in her love of the vineyard itself, preferred to stay behind and learn the intricacies of winemaking from Lucy, who had by then become nearly as knowledgeable in the craft as her husband, having spent years poring over Elias' old notes and experimenting with her own innovations to the family recipe. Life was not without its sorrows in those years, of course, as no life on the frontier could reasonably expect to be. A late frost one spring damaged a significant portion of the crop, forcing the family to tighten their belts through a lean winter, though the resilience of the old vines, which John had promised all those years before would not die easily, saw them through to a better harvest the following year. An illness swept through the valley when Margaret was still a small child, taking several neighbors and nearly claiming young Elias as well, a terrifying few weeks that tested the family's strength and left both Lucy and John with a deeper appreciation for the fragility of the happiness they had built together. But through each trial, they faced the difficulty side by side, drawing strength from the partnership that had been forged in that first difficult year of restoring the vineyard from ruin. And each hardship, weathered together, only seemed to deepen the bond between them rather than diminish it. On the 10th anniversary of the day Lucy had first walked up that dusty road to claim her inheritance, the family gathered on the veranda of the now thriving farmhouse to celebrate not only the anniversary, but also the christening of a new addition to the family wine cellar, a special reserve vintage that John and Lucy had spent years perfecting, made from the very oldest vines on the property, the ones Lucy Whitaker himself had planted with his own hands nearly 40 years before. They named it simply the Whitaker Reserve, a tribute to the man whose stubborn love of these hills had, however indirectly, brought Lucy and John together. And as the family raised their glasses that evening, Elias, now a strapping boy of 8, Margaret a bright and curious girl of 6, and young William toddling unsteadily between his older siblings under the watchful eye of his parents, Lucy found herself overcome with the enormity of the life she had built in this place that had once seemed, to her tired and grieving heart, like nothing more than a burden to be managed. "To Elias Whitaker," John said, raising his glass, his other arm wrapped securely around Lucy's waist as they stood together watching their children play in the golden evening light. "Wherever he is, I hope he knows what his stubborn old vines have grown into." "And to us," Lucy added, leaning into her husband's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back, the same steady presence that had anchored her through every trial of the past decade. "To the family we built from nothing but ruin and hard work, and I think a fair measure of stubbornness ourselves. Do not forget love," John murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That was the most important ingredient of all." "No," Lucy agreed, smiling as she watched Elias chase his younger sister between the vine rows, their laughter carrying on the warm evening air. "I could never forget that." They stood together a while longer, watching the sun set behind the same western ridge that had greeted Lucy on that first difficult day. The vineyard spread out below them in neat, thriving rows, heavy with fruit that would soon be harvested and pressed into another year's vintage. Another chapter in a story that had begun with abandonment and ruin, but had transformed through patience and partnership and the deep, abiding love that had grown between a woman determined not to be defeated and a mountain man who had found, in helping her rebuild her inheritance, a home and a family of his own that he had never quite believed he deserved. In the years that followed, the vineyard continued to prosper, becoming one of the most respected in the valley, its reputation built not only on the quality of its wine, but on the character of the family who tended it, known throughout the region for their fairness in business dealings, their generosity toward neighbors in times of hardship, and the evident devotion between husband and wife that had, by then, become something of a local legend. The story of the woman who had come from Boston to claim a ruined vineyard and the mountain man who had helped her bring it back to life, and in doing so, had found a love neither of them had thought possible before fate brought them together on that dusty California hillside. Elias grew to manhood and eventually took over much of the day-to-day management of the vineyard himself, having inherited both his father's practical strength and his mother's stubborn determination, while Margaret, true to her early interest in the winemaking craft, eventually established a reputation of her own throughout the region for her innovations in the aging process. Innovations that further elevated the family's already respected vintage. William, the youngest, proved to have less interest in the vineyard itself, and more in the wider business of trade that had grown up around the valley's wine industry, eventually establishing connections that allowed the family's product to be sold not only throughout California, but shipped as far as the eastern markets that Lucy herself had left behind so many years before. A full circle of sorts that brought her considerable satisfaction whenever she thought of it. Through it all, Lucy and John remained partners in every sense of the word, their love for each other only deepening through the decades as they watched their children grow and eventually start families of their own. As they weathered the inevitable difficulties that any long life together brings, illness and loss among their circle of friends and neighbors, the slow changes that came to the valley as more settlers arrived, and the old frontier ways gradually gave way to a more settled, established community. But through every change, the vineyard remained a constant, a testament to what two people determined to build something lasting could accomplish together, and the farmhouse that had once stood in ruin, its roof sagging and its porch collapsed, became instead a gathering place for a large and loving family, filled always with the warmth of good food, good wine, and the deep, abiding love that had first bloomed between a woman who refused to be defeated by circumstance and a mountain man who had found, in helping her, the family and the home he had not known he was searching for. On evenings when the work of the day was done, and the children, and eventually grandchildren, had gone to their own beds, Lucy and John would often sit together on the veranda much as they had in those early days of their courtship, watching the moon rise over the vine-covered hills, and John would sometimes take her hand in his grip still strong despite the years, and press a kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that had become as natural and as cherished as breathing. "Any regrets after all these years?" he would sometimes ask, echoing the question from their wedding night, and Lucy's answer never changed. "Only that I did not find my way to you sooner," she would say, and John would smile, that same slow, warming smile that had first caught her attention on that dusty afternoon so many years before, and pull her close against his side. And together they would watch the stars come out over the vineyard that had brought them together, content in the knowledge that whatever years remained to them, they would face together, as they had faced everything since that first fateful meeting among the ruined vines, with love, with patience, and with the deep and unshakable partnership that had transformed a story of abandonment and loss into one of the most enduring love stories the Sonoma Valley had ever known. And so it was that the vineyard Elias Whitaker had planted with such stubborn hope so many decades before continued to flourish long after his passing, tended now by generations of his family who carried forward not only his legacy of fine winemaking, but the deeper legacy of love and partnership that had been forged there between his niece and the mountain man who had helped her bring his ruined dream back to vibrant, thriving life, a legacy that would continue for generations yet to come. Rooted as deeply and as permanently in that California hillside as the ancient vines themselves.